Hello, this is Dr. Garret Castleberry, Associate Professor and Program Director of Communication, Media, and Ethics, and the voice of our public speaking journey online. And I'm here with another mini lecture to talk to us about how we can apply public speaking principles, and more importantly, how we can use these materials to put together our own public speaking projects. It's speech making time, and we're here to talk about informative speaking in this mini lecture session, and I'll try to keep it as brief as possible and essentially introduce us to some basics while also applying this topic of informative speaking to some of the other topics that we've previously covered in the mini lecture series. So sit tight and let's walk through several areas, including what principles guide informative speaking, the purpose of informative speaking, a nice recap for areas that we have talked about before, how we can learn to better prepare ourselves for an informative communication style, and what types of skills might be important in that specific area. Overall, this gives us a definition of the ethical principles behind informative speaking, and that's going to serve us well. All right, so when we're thinking about informative speaking, let's remember it as clearly as possible. We're providing information in an educational kind of setting. We are attempting to remove bias. We are preferring objectivity over subjectivity in an informative setting. And the way in which we go about preparing that informative speech is going to help equip us to execute that, right? We encounter all kinds of biases, right? Personal bias in everyday life ways that we look at the world. And so putting together a proper informative speech is less about how we quote unquote feel or think or what our opinion is about the subject or the topic of interest. It's more about what information do we bring to the table that we have performed tasks in advance, that those research steps, right? That those organizing or outlining principles to put together an information exchange that's of an utmost quality, right? We can't educate others on a topic or a subject if we do not take the same steps ourselves in advance to put that together. So that is one reason why informative speeches are set apart from what we refer to as impromptu speeches. You don't necessarily make an informative speech up on the spot. It requires some preparation, and ideally would also require some practice. And that's why an extemporaneous style of delivery helps us achieve an informative presentation, because let's remember, healthy recap, an extemporaneous style is prepared, rehearsed, not fully memorized necessarily. It's not a script that you're reading, but it is conversational. And we want it to be conversational because that's engaging with the public. Do you like to be read at in your everyday lives, or do you prefer humans to communicate with you conversationally? And at least that's an ideal goal that we have as communicators. All right, and so we want to recognize some qualities of why that approach to informative speaking is significant. And one would be that audiences tend to favor high credibility sources. And the more credibility you have as a speaker, the more engaged you are with your audience. And so if you feel like your topic is distant from us, if the audience may not know enough about it, bridge that gap. That's what you exist for as the speaker. So as you're putting together an informative speech, whatever the topic, you want to assume your audience may know very little and present information in a way that as if we are hearing it for the first time about that topic or subject. That's going to go a long way to helping inform them and make them feel engaged, right? So you can outright tell listeners how a topic relates to them, because your ultimate goal is to ensure their understanding, right? So let's talk about relating to the audience. This is a nice callback to what is quite often an early chapter in most public speaking texts. Not all, but many introduce this idea of audience analysis. in advance of putting a speech together. And this is a chapter and could be an activity that some classes may engage in, and some, depending on the size of the class, the speed of the class, right? Audience analysis may not always be the focal point, but it's important to remember its value, the value that understanding your audience by analyzing them can provide. And so here's an example of how that might work. Let's say we're in a traditional classroom setting and we have plenty of time to put our speeches together, because of course we have plenty of time, right? It is hypothetical after all, but we're in a classroom setting, we're putting together a speech project that may be foreign to our audience and definitely requires some additional background research on our end, researching the topic. And so not only are you thinking more about the topic, you could think strategically about the topic in terms of, what does my audience know about that topic? And that's where audience analysis can come in handy. You could develop something like a survey or an interview questionnaire or something like that's asking your audience questions in advance to try to understand what do they know versus what do they not know. And this helps us solve the riddle of, what should I say? What should I share? Because knowing our audience helps us fill in those blanks, right? It's the old help me, help you, right? Are we too far away from Jerry Maguire? Very, very likely we are. So we want to relate it to the audience if possible. And that's where sometimes your personal stories, your anecdotes, what we call those testimonials, can play a value in perhaps the attention getter or the concluding thought, something like that. You're relating information. But what does an informative presentation do for us? Of course, I'm looking at a couple of notes off to the side here. Informative presentations increase an audience's knowledge about an issue or idea. Another way we could phrase that is to create, here we go, information hunger in your audience. Make them hungry. Make them care about what you're talking about. And wow, is that difficult in today's, sort of digital social media reality where our attention spans struggle to hold on to ideas and information. We're always bouncing and pivoting between, thoughts and engagements and activities, multitasking, quote unquote. But in order to facilitate a learning experience, right? That's what an informative speech in its ideal concept is attempting. We want to create information hunger. In other words, we want to make the audience care about what we are sharing about. All right. And a way we can do that is to arouse curiosity in the audience. And this goes back to my previous suggestion about attention getters and the strength of a rhetorical question when we're first engaging the audience. A rhetorical device gives them gets the audience, the listener, curious about an idea and wanting to know more. And thus, it's a nice transitional way to move into an informative type speech. So, in addition to audiences, let's talk about content and execution. Now, in previous talks, I've walked us through research methods, research processes, pros and cons. And so I'll try to minimize that type of discussion, but let's recognize an informative speech, just like a persuasive speech that I'll cover in the future. An informative speech benefits from research. It benefits from that additional outside labor on your part. So when you're putting it together, if you don't know the main points, it might be because you haven't performed the research yet to learn more about the subject yourself. And remember, it's also not always good to simply draw on our own experiences for the evidence, for the main points, because our own experience might not be enough. We can always learn more about a subject, but it's significant and vital that we understand the logic of following these steps in an order that's designed to maximize our public speaking potential. All right. So the best way you can think about organizing informative speech would be to keep it to 3 main points. Unless, of course, you have what is one of many different types of informative speeches. And so what do I mean by types of informative speeches? Let me preview a couple, but then I encourage you to go to the source, to independently research and procure an understanding of the various types of informative speaking. One type of informative speech could be what we call a how-to speech. Sometimes a how-to speech makes for a good in-class exercise or some kind of breakout exercise, because what you're simply doing then is walking your listener audience through a series of steps, right? How to prepare a meal, how to change oil in a vehicle, how to, right? Complete a course, yes? And so the how-to speech can be a handy one. And sometimes that type of speech could entirely rely upon our personal experience, and that's why we might view it as a little bit of a tier down in the informative pecking order, right? No, but if we're doing a research style informative speech, 3 main points is a strong way to go about that. And let's talk now about some strategies for an informative speech. If we're tackling that 3-point informative speech, what do those 3 points look like? And one of the important phrases that we often use is that it's significant to orient the audience. Already we've talked about audience analysis, yes? And so orienting your audience is important. And you can think about main point number 1 as the ideal space to orient your audience. And when you're orienting the audience, what does that mean, right? I keep using this phrase over and over again because I want us to retain it, but also we're recognizing its place in the speech. And so when to orient an audience is to get everyone on the same page, right? So we can do that by defining key terms or creating a shared context for the topic. Another debate term that's often used to describe this process is to provide background information, background material on the subject or topic. So defining key terms it could be an important aspect of main point number 1. Creating a context ultimately is an important part of main point number 1. Help us understand what this topic is all about. And then another aspect that we can build into main point number 1 would be to provide some historical context to it, or historical background, again, to reuse those terms interchangeably that we've been talking about. That is how you put together a healthy main point number 1 in an informative speech, especially sometimes in a persuasive speech, but we're not talking about that one yet. But the second main point then kind of gets us into ultimately asking and answering a kind of so what question. You've heard of the so what question, hopefully, in your English composition courses or in any time of writing situations. It's a question we're all looking for all the time, right? It's at the heart of problem solving. And so once we understand the issue itself in main point number 1, let's examine it in various ways in main points number 2 and 3. Main point number 2 could take on several forms. And once again, I encourage you to look at our master text for additional references and ways you could put those main points together. But a healthy way to think about the informative is to look at this situation. Sometimes we use that phrase in context or orientation of the situation. Then let's look at some causes. What causes that situation? And maybe that requires going even further back, or perhaps it's just further definition, right? It depends on the topic, of course. But if we're talking about causes, of course, we could explore some effects, right? And sometimes those effects are also in conversation in main point number 2 of the body of your speech. Sometimes they might be withheld until the third main point, but I'll get to that in just a minute. Another way we can approach the middle of the speech is to think about creating an understanding of why the topic is relevant at all. And so perhaps the cause or rather comparison is another way we can do that. And when I say comparison, you can't have a comparison without a contrast, right? Perhaps if you're talking to us about an issue or social cause, you could create a context, help us understand what it is you're defining in main point number 1. And then main point number 2, you're looking at some pros and cons. Okay, what does it mean to look at pros and cons? Let me phrase this another way. Strengths and weaknesses. All right, so pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses, causes and effects, 3 different strategies that you could use in the middle of your informative style speeches. And what does both of these categories offer us? Why just look at one? Why wouldn't we just look at the negatives? Or why wouldn't we just talk about the positives? Well, because let's go all the way back to the beginning of this talk. That gets us closer to a subjective point of view as a speaker, as a communicator. And if our goal is to be informative, educational, we want to be objective, then we want to have a healthy sense of comparison and contrast. Let's look at strengths and let's look at weaknesses of a given topic or subject or whatever we're tackling in the informative speech. That leads us to main point number 3. And so the easiest way that I could explain a quality main point number 3 would be this term implications. And implications, another way of saying implications is the so what question. Can you answer the so what? In other words, so why are we talking about this? So why is it important to have a speech on said topic? And that's where you simply just get to back up what you've already been laying track for all along. All right. So to establish a context or orient the audience, give us a background or history or define key terms in main point number 1. Main point number 2, let's get into that middle ground of assessment, right? Comparison, contrast, strengths and weaknesses, pros and cons, causes and effects. And then that third main point, you could provide us with implications, right? That is a form of answering this so what question that we've been talking about. That is one of several formulas for putting together a successful informative speech. Now, if someone was doing a third type of informative speech, maybe a historical speech, or a fourth type, a biographical speech about some subject, we're absolutely able to learn information there. You wouldn't necessarily have to follow those recommended steps that I provided. But if we're doing an informative speech that could be geared toward building into a persuasive speech later on, and that is quite often an option in many public speaking classes, then if you're tackling a timely topic or subject matter, right? If it's an issue of the day, if it has that kind of social relevance or significance to it, then it's wise to think about those strategies that I've been talking about for putting together the informative speech, because that's going to set you up for success as we translate into a persuasive speech setting. But let me close by offering these words of wisdom, and these words of wisdom as a way to think ahead while we're thinking in the present. All persuasive topics could be given as informative speeches first, but not all informative topics have the richness, have the timeliness, and have the significance to translate into a good, if not great, persuasive speech. All right? So keep that philosophy in mind, and I'll be back to talk to us more about persuasive speaking. Thank you for listening.